Thank you. Good evening. Good evening. It's good to be with you all again. And especially, it's a special blessing to be with you during this auspicious time of celebration of dear Oshi's birthday. So thank you all for gathering today on the theme of this talk. The theme that I've chosen to share with you is on the 4 establishments of mindfulness as an antidote to identity-based suffering. And I just want to first just say that what I'm sharing with you are some thoughts that are an effort to point us toward some of what I've been practicing with and exploring, especially over this last year, but really, in a certain sense, all of my lifetime as an adult, certainly. But I'm certainly learning and on the path and hope to be learning for the rest of my days on the planet, which of course, none of us knows how long we ever have. So I offer these reflections in support of your journey and also as an invitation for us to be supporting each other in this journey, in learning and growing with the support of the Dharma. So I also want to just name that my thinking and practicing with the 4 establishments, foundations of mindfulness, satipatthanas, right? There are different words for this, but my own focusing on this has been really particularly enhanced by some of the writings and teachings of Bhikkhu Analayo, who's a scholar of early Buddhism. Some of you may be familiar with Bhikkhu Analayo's work. So I will just share that I have had the joy and pleasure of being in conversation with Bhikkhu Analayo over the last year or so, as a consequence of writing this book and putting this effort out into the world. He discovered that book, and somehow that led us to being in this kind of rich conversation that is yielding so much. And so what I want to share with you again is, I guess, some ways of thinking about these, what we often call the foundations of mindfulness, mindfulness of the body, right? Mindfulness of feeling, mindfulness of thought, mind itself, and mindfulness of what we might call dharmas, okay? And I'll just say, as I hope, I don't want to, so much of communication travels on all kinds of assumptions, and different types of cultures and contexts rely on each other to be more explicit or less explicit, right? There's this idea, anthropologists and sociologists have us attuned to the idea that, depending on where we are either in a situation where we're assuming a lot of context, everyone sort of knows certain things, and therefore we don't name and aren't as explicit. Those are often denoted high context places, right? Where we just we've been in it together. We sort of know so much, we almost don't even have to speak because we kind of know what's going on between us so often. We can almost read each other's minds. By contrast, this idea of low context culture, where we're coming together from so many different backgrounds, so many different types of experiences, even here, perhaps given the breadth of this community enabled by online gathering, so many different types of Buddhisms and so many types of mindfulnesses, let's say. So in circumstances like that, where we cannot just assume everybody knows what we're talking about, you may hear me be more explicit about certain things than I might otherwise. And so when I'm using the term mindfulness, of course, itself means so many different things these days. For me, it is part of my own humble effort to interpret, apply, embody, and live aspects of the teachings of the Buddha, including, of course, the Eightfold Path, of which right mindfulness is a part. When we think about what mindfulness means as a concept, of course, is going to be running through these remarks. Just to say, I think of it as in terms informed in part by one of the many teachers that I've been privileged to study with and practice with and be mentored by, John Kabat-Zinn, who has this concept of mindfulness that has been is sort of his translation of deep teachings in a particular Buddhist lineage. But it's a way of thinking about mindfulness that focuses on the practices and way of being that result from the practices of paying attention in a particular way with a certain openness and friendliness to what is arising. But when I'm talking about here today, when I use the term mindfulness, I'm going to be referring not only to just this quality of attention, but also to link it very, very much to the actions that we might take in relationship to what we are attending to. So connecting that quality of attending with this idea of a way of being in relationship to what it is that we are attending to. So being present as best we can in the moments of our lives and then taking actions, ideally to minimize harm. And so in these ways, this idea of mindfulness and the practices of mindfulness, of course, are married with our actions in the world. And in that sense, right away, get us engaged in this idea of, acting, engagement. The deep teachings of karma are related to this, right? The idea that our actions matter. It's my shorthand for the deep teachings of karma. Our actions matter. And while we're speaking of preliminaries like this, just to name that, to be established in mindfulness is to presume that we're talking about the embodied humanness that is our vehicle for this short time that we have on the planet. These bodies that we have. And this precious experience of life, however long it is, ultimately in the blink, sort of in the grand scheme of things, just a kind of a blink of the eye. So to be focusing on the establishments or foundations of mindfulness in the context of this short life that we have, in which to be alive is a gift, to be present at all is this kind of miracle, this rare, really it kind of is beyond words. But we try in moments like this to put a bit of words to it. And I think for me, saying a little bit about these kinds of preliminaries, right? The vastness within which our lives, however they are formed and whatever kinds of bodies we're moving through the world in, to be aware on some level of the preciousness of our lives, of the fact that they will end, of the called to do what we can to have the actions that we take do little harm, do as little harm as possible, do no harm if we're fortunate. So again, I'm just naming these sort of ethics of the big frame within which we might talk about mindfulness in the ways that I've been talking about it here, as and in the establishments of mindfulness as a support for dealing with identity-based suffering. When I use the phrase identity-based suffering, I mean the suffering that can come out of our being in these bodies in a social world, right? On that plane of awareness that's about the fact that we move among other social beings. We inevitably then engage each other with the terms of our culture. So in our culture today, we know something about race and gender and sex orientation and all of these things. And there are many more. I'm just naming those few ways that we might identify ourselves and find meaning and connection with others. But we also know there can be a lot of pain associated with these identities. Whether we talk about racism, ableism, sexism, other forms of othering that get in the way of that can get in the way of connection, can get in the way of care, frankly. And so, when I think about these terms and all these issues from my own perspective, living 53 years on the planet in this, body, for those who in some way or another may be visually impaired, again, a brown body, cisgender female. And if I were standing, you'd see I'm somewhat kind of petite. And so when I move through the social realm, people notice these things about me. All right. Just as I notice different characteristics of others. And so because the cultures and the places that we've lived in have trained us, if you will, often informally, in the meanings to associate with these different kinds of social identities. Trained us, again, often informally. Most of us have not signed up for any kind of class training in othering other people or belonging, right? But we know something about what it means to be considered female in a world, and some of the particular kinds of vulnerabilities that can come with a female body in a world in which a hierarchy around value has often placed male bodies at the top or in the center. When it comes to leadership, exercise, the rightful exercise of power, who belongs. And so for me, in a female body, as well in a body that's brown, a culture that is made a lot about who matters and who doesn't, tied to colorations of the body. So there can be, again, often unbidden pain and triggering that can come from all of these things. And of course, we're meeting at a time when there's just a lot of trauma in the air that any one of us might be facing just because we're present to climate distress, smoke in the air, right? We've been sheltered because of coronavirus, all of us reminded of our hyper vulnerability as these soft-bellied, carbon-based beings. So we have these existential challenges, and then on top of it, those of us who are looking at social suffering sometimes use the phrase surplus suffering to describe this extra kind of suffering that I'm talking about, that our cultures kind of add to the basic existential challenge of just surviving in a planet where everything's connected and challenged in particular ways right now. So what your own embodiment has taught you about these things is going to be maybe very different from what mine has taught me. Does that make some sense? Each of us, as we come together to look at social identity-based harm, we've all got in our bones and bodies we've learned some things about this. We've experienced some of it. We have noticed or witnessed, borne witness to jokes or, ways of kind of being trained to orient ourselves to recognize and value certain communities and people and voices more than others. And of course, if we're in this community, perhaps we've also been working very hard to minimize the impact of all of that. For me, though, I recognize that even though I've been, practicing meditation for more than 20 years in this kind of formal way, and I was born in a family where a kind of orientation toward certainly some sort of spiritual religious practice. I was born in a Christian-based family. I've always, been able to witness people seeking to center with intentionality on something more, right? Something beyond simply all of the trainings of our culture. And I think that must be true for all of us, right? Or else some kind of bell of awakening around where there must be something more than the, conventional trainings of our culture is part of what brought us to this moment together. So let's just say as a given, we're all working with whatever trainings. We're not receiving them. We're not simply receiving them and operating as, we're trying as best we can not to operate on automatic pilot around these trainings, right? We're actually probably trying to disrupt biases in many different ways. And yet, right? This doesn't mean that we can rest assured that they don't operate. There are many people who have come into places of meditation practice, temples, sanghas, and felt uncomfortable, felt perhaps that assumptions were being made based on their bodies and abilities and disabilities and so on. And certainly just to be kind of frank, in a space where you are one of a small number of a minoritized demographic can in and of itself just make you feel uncomfortable, especially today. And especially when a lot of our communities of practice are disproportionately skewed by one race or group or another. A legacy of our history, a legacy of so many different things. So, for example, if a person like me walks into a community center or space where there are disproportionately white bodies, I might have to kind of do a little bit of extra work to kind of feel at home and safe. And I might be looking for cues from you that I am at home and safe and welcome. And so some of us have been really looking at how is it that we talk about taking refuge in the three jewels, right? The Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha. How do we also make refuge for those bodies who might feel themselves to be a little bit other? And how do we see that as part of our responsibility, perhaps, to take be a little mindful of what it might be like for somebody to enter into a certain space and feel themselves to be just one of maybe a certain kind of demographic that's minoritized in that space. I say minoritized, meaning in the global sense, they might not be a minority. In their other communities, they're not a minority. In this one, they are. How is it that we explore ways of helping create a sense of hospitality, warmth, inviting, inclusion, notwithstanding these differences? That requires us to be willing to see them. And then the challenge can be, how do you sort of see these different identity categories without getting stuck in them, without revivifying hard-bounded notions of difference. This is one of the reasons why the idea of colorblindness has appeal. It's like, well, if we just don't pay attention to any of these differences, then we're gonna be okay. The trouble is, it's easier said than done. Easier said than done. Yeah. And especially in our culture right now, where we're being we're always getting different trainings. If you're paying attention at all, maybe many of you may have better filters than I do in terms of news and what's happening in politics. But we are, as human beings in a world, often met with retrainings. It almost feels like the more things change, the more they stay the same kind of messages about, well, let's now organize our politics and our way of thinking about who belongs and who doesn't, around notions of walls and notions of restricted voting rights, notions of nationality and the political viability of identity groups that somehow seem to just be inviting us to go right back into the past. I don't know, maybe I'm the only one who's noticed this. So we're constantly there's an effort to retrain us back into the idea of our tribal, kind of natural differences. And I'm just going to name that race and the language around race and racism is one such training that I certainly feel in the air a lot these days. And how do I feel it? I feel a little bit of a heightened sense of suspicion when folks see my body coming, even in the neighborhood where I live right here. I live in California, in San Francisco. I walk through this neighborhood. I can feel a kind of chill, a kind of chilliness that somehow arises in people who do not know me based on what I look like. And, it triggers in me, some unpleasant experiences I've had in the past. And the need to kind of protect myself from being disrespected, or maybe having somebody hurl a racial slur my way, as has happened while I've just been walking on the street before. So you know how this works, right? If we've had a bad experience, and I'm sure you all know what I'm talking about to some degree, perhaps. You have an experience, and then, again, given the trainings of our culture, we're tempted to say, all right, if I see another person like that, I might have that same kind of experience with that person. So feel what happens then in the body, mindfulness of the body, foundation of mindfulness, when we are in a situation like that. What happens? Bringing awareness to what can happen in the body as a result of these social trainings, these deep trainings of our culture, some explicit, some implicit, some coming at us as subtly as how did our parents and loved ones look at, receive? Did they smile at certain people? Did they give eye contact to certain people, not to others? Very subtle training sometimes. But how do they show up in our bodies when we're encountering each other? How do they show up in subtle orientations, not to even acknowledge the presence of certain types of bodies? Or how do they show up in like a subtle clenching because either we were trained to or we had some experience around certain kinds, we've been trained to turn away from, or we've had experiences with certain types of bodies that have left us feeling, okay, I got to work with this, fear, clenching. Is everybody getting a feel for this idea of how mindfulness of the body, sensing what's happening in the body, thoughts, emotions, sensations, sometimes starting with actually sensations, emotions, and thoughts, right? Or these I'm using concepts now to describe certain categories of embodied experience. And I think of thoughts as a category also of embodied experience, although you can think of it as separate. Mindfulness, of course, of the body as a foundation for mindfulness of feeling tones. What's happening in the body can be associated with a sense of pleasant feeling, unpleasant feeling, neutrality. Mindfulness of feeling tones, okay? So if we are in a place where we're socially uncomfortable, we might start to feel a little bit of stiffness or tightness or some kind of heightened sense of, need to scan for threat. This is what I feel sometimes in places where I'm not known. And so I'm feeling that in my body. There are feeling tones associated with that. That's not comfortable. It doesn't feel good, let's just say. And then there might be some emotional piece that's tied to that, right? So basic core feelings of pleasant feeling, or core ways of describing feeling tone, pleasant, unpleasant, neutral, marry with more sophisticated combinations, we might say, of feeling, energy, and thoughts to describe more nuanced emotions, fear, anger, anxiety, frustration. So becoming aware of all of these kinds of more complex, let's say, body, feeling, thought notions that we call emotions, embodied sensations, energies that we call emotions. In an instant, the way a white man that comes, is coming down the street my way that I don't know, this person may or may not be thinking about me one way or the other, but it could trigger some aspect I've had in my body of someone who was in a similar kind of truck coming my way and yelling out the N-word. Or someone who had a similar kind of beard walking toward me with a baseball bat on a playground and walking around me in a circle that just didn't feel comfortable and made me feel like maybe I should leave since I was there by myself and he was the only other person there. Do you see what I'm saying? Like these experiences that we have can get attached. I was in a conversation, a talk on these themes with another group recently, and someone put into the circle for our reflection is a white-bodied man that he had been abused at some point by a black-bodied man. So I'm naming that to say, again, I've got my own experiences, you have yours. We all, if we think about the particular types of people who have harmed us, and then marry those perhaps with narratives in our culture that tell us, oh, well, maybe those types of people are dangerous anyway, or here's a narrative about why you shouldn't trust those people, in addition to your own embodied experience, which just, can help reinforce it. So I'm just touching a little bit into how my own experience with this helps inform what I mean by working with mindfulness of the body, of feelings, of thoughts. The first three foundations of mindfulness, and then the fourth of dharmas, mindfulness of dharmas. And the way in which I'm using that today is to really be thinking about some of the hindrances, the things that can get in the way of just feeling our belonging, our ease, our the way that these bodies are not as separate as we think, the way that that we can wake up from the dream of our suffering at any moment. What gets in the way? For now, I'm calling those the dharmas, the hindrances. The clinging to some notion of the good, or some notion of that kind of body, that kind of man that I need to be afraid of. Or it's often, a little subtler than that for me right now, but I'll give you an example that just came from today. So I'm walking through my neighborhood and, I see a couple of people and, in the coronavirus adaptation period that we're still in, whenever you see anybody, you're almost like, oh my God, maybe I can say hello. Or at least I do, because I'm a little bit deprived of connection beyond my partner, who I see all the time. So I'm walking and I see first a white man come out of his house. And I think, well, I will, as I tend to do, try to be friendly and say hello or wave. And he did not respond, which I have to admit is not that uncommon. It's so often these days that people just, we're so trained, especially in this urban environment where I am in San Francisco. It's not like where I grew up in North Carolina, where people used to at least say hello to each other on the street. There is a kind of a way in which people don't say hello very often. It's kind of unusual, but I tend to want to disrupt that and say hello to folks. So this man didn't really respond, kind of looked past me. And then I saw him though, saw another couple across the street who happened to be Asian bodied, right, from appearances. They came out and the man spoke to them from kind of over my head as I'm walking through. He speaks to them. And I'm like, oh, well, he spoke to them. He didn't speak to me. And so I walked through this and I also spoke to the Asian heritage couple, right? And they also kind of didn't speak back. So I'm like trying to connect. They're not connecting with me. So I walked through this and for a minute, I'm having a little bit of like, attachment to my own sense of the good. My sense of the good in that moment is I speak and somebody will speak back and they will acknowledge me and they will, I'll have that burst of connection and love that I was looking for. That was not to be in that moment. And so I'm walking along and I felt, in my body a little bit of the, I haven't had some stickiness around that. Some like me trying to make a story about what was going on there. That was kind of, something about this block, I'm different and they don't know me and therefore they're willing to speak to each other, but they're not willing to speak to me. Okay, something like that. Does that make some sense? Can you imagine me doing that? As I continue walking though, I thought to myself, a practice, what else is here? What else did I notice? Was I maybe picking and choosing what to pay attention to in that interaction and missing something? Well, I really listened again to what I heard while I was walking through. I heard this gentleman speaking across the street to a neighbor that he obviously didn't know well, but knew to some degree, asked them a question right away. Like, how is this gentleman, how is he doing, basically? Asking the woman how the man was doing. And not knowing the whole story, I could tell there had been some sort of health incident. Something had happened and they had maybe been to the hospital. There had been some hospitalization. There had been something. And the white man's effort was to check in on this Asian couple's like well-being. And my little trying to be friendly Black sister walking through perhaps just wasn't as important in that moment, right? So here I was creating a story or attempted to create a story in which, of course, I had to be at the center. We needed to be, the star, and, how are they relating to me, me and mine? Bringing awareness to what was happening in my body and the thoughts that I was tempted to latch onto, and then asking what else was there, right? Helped me to at least let go in an instant of the narrative that I was about to try to invest in of, well, on that block, I'm not welcome. I have no idea. I really don't know. What I do know is I witnessed a bit of neighborly caring that had nothing to do with me. And I'm sort of glad that I witnessed it. Does that make sense? This is not to say there might have also been a little bit of we don't know that Black woman. That I would refer them to somehow, address. I don't know, really. And mindfulness of the thoughts that I was trying to figure out, like, and trying to know, and the assumptions I might have been tempted to make, helped me to sort of dislodge and get back into this place of like, I really don't know. There's no need to make a whole big trip out of what happens on that particular block or that, or any of that. So that practice of from mindfulness of the body, thoughts, emotions, to where am I getting stuck? Where am I clinging to some idea, trying to understand something in a way that makes sense for me, which is not necessarily the whole story. So I'm just describing that as just a very simple example from everyday life. I could have spent the rest of the day talking to people about how, folks just don't speak to me as a Black woman. But instead, somehow, thank goodness, I was able to feel my way into, you know what, you don't know. And what you do know was not necessarily about this body. So all of that is to say, we work with it. I work with it. It's an ongoing, for me, invitation to be present to the call to understand some of the ways that the legacies of being a body in this moment, in this culture, and having had experiences in the world that have harmed me somewhat, and I'm still trying to, overcome all the time, how that's showing up and how my practice of, this practice of mindfulness can help me open up sometimes when I'm tempted to get small, keep waking up to the possibility inherent in any moment, and just mindful of the temptation, yes, of getting stuck instead of navigating these waters the middle way. So I thank you all for taking the time to be with me, to reflect in this way. And may these simple words, reflections on these simple experiences of a life, be of at least some small benefit in ways seen and unseen. Thank you.